It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Amy Williams, who contacted me a few weeks ago asking about information on the Kindertransport, and I thought this would be a great opportunity for her to reach out to the local community, and if there were any people who could help her with her research, that would be wonderful. And Amy's doing her PhD on Kindertransports at Nottingham Trent University, and I think that what really comes up in my work here with the materials from Victoria and Melbourne is that it's never a straightforward narrative, and we hear these sort of stories that we think are correct, and there's always a variable that may change our understanding historically of what happens. For example, recently we had a donation where the couple came to Melbourne separately, and then they'd met in Warsaw, they came here, they met again and got married, and each of them were trying to bring out the rest of their family from Poland, and getting rejection letters from the Australian Immigration Department. It sort of leads to that whole question of, how much did the Australian government help or hinder with their restrictive policies. So, there's that mythology that Australia has the highest number of Holocaust survivors per capita. But I know that Shannon Biederman, who works at the Jewish Museum in Sydney, she's dispelling that as a sort of a myth. So it's really important that researchers continue to ask the hard questions and delve into the details, and using case studies to see whether the known histories match up with individual stories. So I'd like you all to welcome Amy warmly, and thank you for doing this for us.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for being here, and thanks for inviting me. My overall thesis is, the title at the moment anyway, is Memory of the Kindertransports in National and International Perspectives. So my thesis seeks to present an examination of the different national and international memories of the Kindertransports. Kindertransports is understood here as referring not just to the actual rescue of Jewish children from Nazism, but also its effects, i.e. transplantation to a strange environment. There is yet to be a true comparison of how host nations, Britain, Sweden, Holland, Belgium, the US, Canada, Australia and New Zealand received the transportees and integrated them, and of how memories of the Kindertransportees and the other transportees were integrated, and of how the memories of the Kindertransports and the nation's memories of the Kindertransports developed. A comparison of these various host countries will reveal that memory of the Kindertransports was not uniform, but shaped by national factors such as the country's role during the war, their post-war politics, economics and social developments, social and cultural policies towards refugees, and nationally conditioned memory discourses. However, no memory is entirely nationally bound. Increasingly, Holocaust memory operates in a transnational, even global network. The specific interaction of such global memory with international patterns, memory patterns, in the case of the Kindertransports will be examined. My BA dissertation focused on British memory of the Kindertransports, revealing that interest in this event emerged quite late, the 1980s. British historiography of the Kindertransportees accounts and museum exhibitions was studied to reveal how memory of the Kindertransports is represented in Britain. My MA dissertation extended this focus, reflecting upon whether the patterns uncovered in my undergraduate work are also replicated in literature. My BA and MA studies therefore provided me with both the subject knowledge and methodological experience required for the proposed project. The first aim of the project is to map out the ways in which the Kindertransportees were received in their host nations, something that has only particularly been researched despite a growing body of work on Kindertransports. The second is to identify for each country how memory of the Kindertransports were articulated in autobiographical, political, social and cultural form. The third is to undertake a comprehensive assessment of these forms of expression, exploring interactions between them. The project will be aware of the need to differentiate between forms of memory. Nevertheless, I believe it will be possible to identify different patterns. I believe it will be possible to identify broad national patterns within each country. Finally, my PhD project will provide an international comparison of memory of the Kindertransports. The increasing cosmopolitanisation of Holocaust memory will have impact on all 4 countries under consideration. The research will explore how national memory patterns intersect with global ones and, in terms of academic impact, expand knowledge of the aftermath of the Kindertransports. So national memory in this thesis refers to memory of the Kindertransports in a specific country. It suggests that each country may have a particular way of remembering. International memory of the Kindertransports refers simply to the fact that several countries remember this event. Transnational memory of the Kindertransports focuses more on the fact that memories across countries can share common features. However, national memory can be exported and help to create a transnational memory. For example, the British national narrative of the Kindertransports is a transnational memory because countries such as Australia and New Zealand have incorporated parts of the British narrative into their own national narratives. This could be due to the fact that these nations share a common history through the Commonwealth, but Britain's national narrative of the Kindertransports has marginalised its links to Australia and New Zealand, as it has tended to focus inwards rather than outwards. Moreover, British acts of rescue are only compared with countries such as America to highlight that Britain's scheme to rescue children was government-backed, unlike America's rescue effects. But transnational memory can also be shaped through several border crossings, i.e. ideas going that way, this way and that. So that's just a brief introduction to my thesis, and now I'm going to specifically focus on museum exhibitions. So this paper is entitled The Representation of the Kindertransports in British Museum Exhibitions. So, there we go. We've all been to a museum, we've all journeyed around the exhibit, and we have all paused for a moment during this journey to stop and look at something that catches our eye and our focus. We gaze at certain objects, texts and video clips that capture our attention, but do we question why they are in that particular place, why they are framed in that particular way, and how this affects our understanding of this piece of history that we are directly looking into? Likewise, do we stop to reflect upon what is not on display, the stories that are not presented for our eyes to look upon but stored in the museum's archives? Moreover, does the museum visitor ever question the museum's definitions of certain events, groups and individuals? Museums, like individuals, communities and nations, select what memories to remember and those to marginalise. But should the museum visitor not question why these stories are selected over others? In this paper, I wish to discuss how the Kindertransports are represented in museum exhibitions around Britain, from Beth Shalom, the National Holocaust Centre in Newark, to the Imperial War Museums in London and Manchester, and finally to the Wiener Library, also located in London. I'm focusing on both permanent and temporary exhibitions, and this too poses various challenges that I will discuss later within the paper. To continue, all of these museums represent the story of the Kindertransports to the public, and therefore they also reveal something about how Britain remembers, represents and commemorates this historical event. But they also have their own agendas and aims, and each imply different representational forms of media to communicate their stories of rescue, resettlement and survival. This paper will be divided into 4 main sections, which are museum exhibitions themselves, the museum visitors, the exhibitions the museums, and the narratives of the Kindertransports that are illustrated to reflect upon whether the museums stick to more conventional narratives of this rescue operation or whether they challenge our assumptions. By this I mean whether or not they present the national British narrative of the Kindertransports, which I shall discuss shortly, and what I mean by this, or whether they tell us stories which have previously been overlooked, and whether they spark new debates and conversations about this memory. For example, do these museums get us to think about wider debates such as immigration and the status of refugees today compared to those in the 1930s and 40s? So the main aim of this paper then is to reflect upon whether British museum exhibitions present the national British narrative of the Kindertransports, or whether they question our assumptions of this historical event. The second aim is to reflect upon who the exhibitions are structured towards, i.e. children or adults. Are there some things deemed too upsetting for young children to discover? No, compared to more adult audiences who may be able to think more critically about what they are looking at. The third factor to consider is the differences between listening to a survivor face to face, watching a video, or reading about their story. Is one more engaging than the other? Finally, it is important to highlight whether the museums plan to adapt their exhibitions in the future, and if these changes will affect how the narrative of the Kindertransports are being represented to the public. One example of this is the new technology being used at Beth Shalom and the US HMM, as they are currently working on new projects that will allow us to see a 3D image of a survivor who will be able to talk to us, answer our questions when the real survivors are no longer with us. But how will this affect our understanding of the Kindertransports? How will looking at a 3D image compared to being able to speak to a survivor in person? And how will this affect how we learn about the Holocaust? For the purpose of this paper and the time limit given, I will mainly speak in depth about one important museum theory about exhibitions and their visitors, but this will be expanded upon in my overall PhD project, as I will look at Graham Black, Stuart Birches and Avril Albers, to name just a few. I will, however, draw on and show an awareness of other theories throughout this paper, but the main theory that I want to use is the critical museum visitor, which suggests that the museum is like a script and that it reveals codes that we as visitors decode, enabling us to identify patterns within the museum, but also ones that speak to us beyond the physical space of the museum, the realm of national and cultural memory. This theory also allows us to reflect upon the typical and ideal museum visitor, but also, and most importantly, the critical museum visitor, who studies how the visual, written and spatial features of a museum collectively implicate an ideal visitor. This theory is vital as it reveals something entirely different from assessing actual audience reactions and characterising the typical visitor, because the critical museum visitor asks questions and explore what is left unspoken. So, quickly, my methodology is a mixed methodology which considers museum studies, memory studies, oral history, conventional historical methods, and observation and photography. So some quick questions to consider throughout this paper. How do the exhibitions represent the Kindertransports? Who visits these exhibitions and for what purposes? How do the museums cater to their audiences? How does the journey around the exhibition affect our understanding of the Kindertransports? What are the museum exhibitions? How are the museum exhibitions different or similar to one another? What are the future aims of these museums? And how will this affect our understanding of the Kindertransports? How do we learn? Do we learn more from listening to a survivor face to face, reading their story, or looking at artefacts? So I'm sure that the majority of you in the room know about the Kindertransports, but I'm going to discuss what I mean by the British narrative of the Kindertransports, not in terms of history, but in terms of memory. However, some of you may ask, what is the difference? As Anthony Grenville has revealed, the British, in particular, have come to see and celebrate the Kindertransports as evidence of their humanity and generosity, as part of a story of their finest hour in the war against National Socialism. He continues to highlight that, with the passage of the years, depictions of the Kindertransports have lost some of their intensity, of their anguish. The British national narrative of the Kindertransports, one could argue, frames this story in a positive way, which of course is true, as 10,000 children were escaped from Nazi persecution, and many opened their homes to them. However, this story has tended to be represented in a rosy fashion. Of course, But of course, life is not all rosy. Rather, some children were not placed in loving homes and experienced much trauma as a result. Moreover, the British narrative seems to focus more on the positives rather than the negatives of the Kindertransport story, marginalising some of the Kinder stories. So, before moving forward, I will now discuss how the narrative of the Kindertransports are represented by 4 mini case studies, and in doing so I will reflect upon whether a conventional or unconventional narrative is presented. As I mentioned earlier, I will be using the critical museum visitor theory to look more closely at these exhibitions, but this theory is also useful for my methodology too, because I will now show you I've gone past that bit, sorry. These are some pre-visit questions to consider, which are really useful in terms of researching, going to several different museums, because you kind of get a focus on what you're going to be looking at in all of them. So what does the architecture and surroundings tell us about the museum? What stories are selected? How do the exhibitions display their artefacts? Do the exhibitions focus solely on the British memory, or is an international aspect presented? What is the main message that the visitor takes away with them? Is there more than one exhibition, and how do they relate to one another? Is there a difference between a museum and a memorial, both are sites of memory? And finally, what is the lighting like, and what is the architecture of the museum like inside? Oops. So, there we go. One case study then is the Imperial War Museum, which is, this is in London, this one. Sorry, this is in the wrong order. Oh, there we go. So the first museum that I want to talk to you about is the Imperial War Museum South, as it is located in the capital city. The exhibition was opened in 2000, and it has clearly been influenced by the national British narrative. The architecture of the museum is militaristic, large, stone, and quite masculine. Inside the museum, the narrative of the Kindertransports is located within the main Holocaust exhibition, which is visually quite dark. The textures are mostly wood, metal and glass, and overall the feel of the exhibit is quite industrial. The exhibition reveals a linear narrative of the Holocaust, from the rise of Nazism to the ghettos to the camps and then to liberation. The Kindertransports is located after the section about theories of racial science and the Nuremberg laws, and the main caption for the Kindertransport section is "Thousand Seek Refuge," which shows the scale of those fleeing, but it combines all of these various refugee experiences into one overall narrative. The actual placement of the Kindertransport section though is placed to one side, and the visitor can walk around it, and it could easily be overlooked. And the board that depicts Kristallnacht is after the Kindertransports, which is chronologically in the wrong order. The visitor's journey around the exhibit at this point is quite disjointed, because one could argue that Kristallnacht was one of the main events that marked the turning point, as many families and various organisations sprang into action, trying to help the children flee from Nazi persecution. The narrative of the Kindertransport that is represented is one that both incorporates female and male stories, and it does highlight that the children were very upset and bewildered when they arrived, as the main text reads, "Our first day in Birmingham was hell. It suddenly hit me that we were in a foreign country, without knowing the language, without relatives or friends, and I was trying desperately to be a brave 13-year-old boy was expected to behave. I spent most of that day in and out of the toilet, so that no one could see tears rolling down my cheeks." Another interesting part of this exhibit are the quotes from the newspapers at the time, which include the Daily Express from the 23rd of August 1938. "Dreadful are the affiliations of the Jewish people. Every warm heart must sympathise deeply with them in their plight. Certainly there is no room for Jews in Britain. Where we have over a million of our own people out of work and biting their nails. But places must be found for the Jews. There are plenty of uninhabited parts of the world where, giving a touch of Christian spirit, they may yet find homes. The Daily Herald from the 26th of August 1938. If this is coming to the help of refugees, then what would the nations do if they mean to desert them? The Evening News from the 13th of July 1938. Every country is privately determined not to become the spiritual home of the great unwanted. Money will be provided if need be, but the law of self-preservation demands that the word enter be removed from the gate. These quotes are not easily found, rather they are found at the side of the main Kindertransports exhibition, pushed to one side, out of the way. They are there, of course, but they do not question or engage in a debate about how people reacted at the time and how this affects our memory of the Kindertransports. We remember the Kinder as small children with labels around their necks, innocent and looking very tired after their long journeys. But these quotes tell us something about the complexity around their identity and the identities of refugees in general. One narrative that is not included in this exhibit is that of the parents, of their loving and selfless actions to find some safe haven for their children. Likewise, the story stops in 1939. It stops when they arrive, and we do not know what happened to the children after. We are not told about how some struggled to adapt to a new way of life. There are hints, but no in-depth discussion, and we are not told that some Kinder did not live with loving foster families. Rather, some were made to become domestics. Moreover, although there are meta-narratives on display, the overall narrative of this exhibition and the Holocaust exhibition, which is the other permanent one, is one that reveals a nationalistic narrative which represents the myth of Britain standing alone, defending the evils of Nazism. Tony Kushner has highlighted that the exhibit attempts to represent the nature of Britishness or Englishness to the people of the nation, and in doing so, an us and them narrative is created. The images of the Nazis tend to confirm that the perpetrators must have been monsters, subhuman, and that the British were ordinary people who opened up their hearts and homes to rescue and shelter those in need. This contrast of identities is continued throughout the exhibition, and its climax is presented at the end of the exhibit, where the exhibit ends with Belsen confirming the righteousness of the British war effort. These representations of identity are complex, and it leads me to think about, where does this leave Kinder who came from Germany? Some have broken all ties with their lands of birth, but others have travelled back to places where they spent their childhoods. And how these Kinder's identities with Germany is not explored within the exhibition. I agree with Kushner that in terms of the Imperial War Museum, it does not engage in any debate with the place of Britain as a bystander nation in the Nazi era, and that the absence of discussion does not allow us to any self-reflection about how this memory is used today. For example, the newspapers are discussing similar debates today about how refugees are treated, how they are received, and their reactions and concerns of those in power towards them. The national British narrative, therefore, is preserved in the Imperial War Museum South, because a celebratory tone of Britain's rescue of the Kinder is the main narrative that the visitor takes away with them. Yes. The next exhibition that I want to discuss with you is the Imperial War Museum's North. Again, similar to the Imperial War Museum South, the architecture is militaristic, large and metal, but this museum's architecture confuses the visitor, which could reflect the confusing destruction and complex nature of war itself. The Kindertransports are also located within the main exhibition, but instead of locating the story in the Holocaust or Britain's involvement in this historical event, the Kindertransports sit within the context of children and war, how children see war, their feelings and thoughts towards it, as well as the connected narratives of refugee children and the British evacuee children. Similar to the Imperial War Museum South, the visitor is shown the story of the Kindertransports by peering into a glass case, which contains artefacts from the time, with their descriptions accompanying them to the side. The main focus is on the objects that the children took with them on their journeys. These include a doll, letters, clothing, and the most iconic, the suitcase. These narratives show that the Kinder's childhoods continued in Britain, but there was no discussion about the trauma that they suffered, or many effects that separation would have upon their childhoods, but also their adulthoods. The the narrative of displacement is also one that is significant in the Imperial War Museum North, as it reveals to the visitor that the Kinder were displaced more than once. They were uprooted from their homelands and arrived in Britain, but they also were evacuated to the countryside, and some would even journey to other countries such as America and Canada. These stories show their difficulties to adapt to new social customs and language, but they do not reveal the adult Kinder stories, what jobs they would choose, what happened to their families, and how they told their children about their story. As you walk around the exhibit, the narrative of the Kindertransports appears in two sections, the second being next to the wall of suitcases. This section talks about the variety of stories of migration and about the overseas evacuation of British children. The wall of suitcases is striking as it could symbolise the repair and rebuilding of displaced peoples, what they brought with them and what they left behind. The suitcase could also highlight the journeys of return, the Kindertransports in reverse, where Kinder have travelled back to their lands of birth. But this wall could also show a gateway into a new land, a new way of life, a new start, if you will. However, the fact that it is made up from suitcases suggests that the memories and physical artefacts will never be forgotten. There is a dualistic picture created within the exhibit because it discusses the impacts on the lives of those who found refuge elsewhere, be they Kinder or British evacuees. Here, there is also a sense of familiarity because these stories of exile and immigration are brought closer to home because of the British connection which runs between both these stories. Do we further understand the Kindertransports through other stories of British children's journeys to find safety? So the third exhibition is the National Holocaust Centre in Nottinghamshire in the UK. This is very different to the previous two exhibitions. The museum was started by the Smith family and it has developed into a pedagogical centre where school children come to learn about the Holocaust and Kindertransports and the Rwandan genocide. Its location is in rural Nottinghamshire, which is completely different to the big cities that the Imperial War Museums are located in. The centre's architecture is homely, with memorial rose gardens, sculptures, a pond, a library and learning rooms. One could argue that this museum's narrative is more individual because it focuses on the survivors themselves and their voices compared to the very British national narratives of the two Imperial War Museums. This museum is an experience as you have the opportunity to listen to a survivor face to face, to visit the two permanent exhibitions and to reflect in the gardens. Although the narrative of the Kindertransports is represented in both the main exhibitions, I'm only going to focus on one due to the time limit. The Journey exhibition is a sensory exhibition that transports the visitor back in time, in some ways quite literally, as you have to enter into a lift which takes you down into a typical German Jewish home of the 1930s. There is even the smell of chicken soup. This journey down into the exhibit, from being stood outside on the railway station, somehow picks away at the sediments of history, and the visitor is invited to consider what life was like for Jewish children in the 1930s. As you move around the exhibit, you move into the schoolroom, the high street, a tailor's shop, a hidden space, a train, a boat, and then finally the artefacts room, which symbolises the arrival of the children in Britain. In each room there are artefacts, videos of survivor testimonies, and we are introduced to a fictional character called Leo. We are encouraged to follow and listen to Leo's diary around the exhibit as he documents what was going on in his hometown, how he was rejected by his peers, how his father's shop had been raided, and how his parents came to the decision to send him on a Kindertransport to Britain, and his feelings when he is on the train about to embark upon his journey. The Journey exhibit is different to the two previous exhibitions because it focuses on the survivors' stories, and for school children especially, it gets them to think about how they would feel if they were a refugee and how they would react to these events that Leo and survivors talk about throughout the exhibit. The next case study is the Wiener Library. This was a temporary exhibition. The main question that was asked was, did anti-Semitism affect British attitudes and policies towards refugees before the war? The Kindertransport part sat within the wider context of Britain's involvement in the Holocaust, and the question, why wasn't Auschwitz bombed, was also asked. The Kindertransport was at was at the start and at the end of the exhibition, and it discussed individual stories. So there are other museum exhibitions that I haven't talked about today, but I will in my overall PhD. These include the Jewish Museum in London, the Windermere Boys, which is in the Lake District, County Down, which is this one, just here, and this was in Northern Ireland, and other temporary exhibitions from the Wiener Library, especially the temporary exhibition from 2013 on the anniversary of the Kindertransports. I've also visited America last year on a similar research trip to this one, and made some early conclusions from this trip. So many of the narratives that are on display are from male perspectives. All of the exhibitions mentioned have used a mixture of testimony, artefacts and text. These museums plan to develop their sites both similarly and differently to one another, and there are similar photos used in both the British and the American exhibitions. Beth Shalom and the US HMM have both used a diary to talk about a child's experience of the Holocaust, and they have both employed us to use our senses when we journey around the exhibit. And then recently I was in New Zealand. The museums that I have visited so far in New Zealand included the War Memorial Museum in Auckland, the Museum of New Zealand in Wellington, and of course the Holocaust Centre also in Wellington. These museums all discuss Jewish migration to New Zealand, which either came via Britain or via more direct channels from continental Europe. And some early conclusions from this visit was the exhibition at the National Holocaust Centre of New Zealand starts and ends with narratives about children in the Holocaust. Female voices are at the forefront of this memory. Again, the exhibition uses a mixture of testimony, artefacts, text and imagery, and the visitor can explore narratives from two ladies who came on both the first and second Dexton transports. And then these are some pictures from the museums in Sydney and of course the museum here. I think these two museums are really interesting because the Jewish Museum in Sydney has an exhibit that talks about both the Kindertransports and the Dinera. And what we've recently, well not recently, but what we were researching this morning here is that the Kindertransport exhibition at this centre talks about one particular survivor and her sketchbook and birthday card, which is a really interesting story because she came to Britain, later she was interned and she was reunited with her mother, but she came from Berlin to Belgium and then from Belgium to England, which is a really interesting story in itself. The Kindertransport narrative is interesting here because it sits within the children's section, which talks about hiding in the camps, surviving on your own. It shows how children were not safe and many were traumatised by what they had witnessed. And it's really interesting that this exhibition is right next to the memorial buttons. I think that's a really touching museum. So some early conclusions from my visit so far in Australia. So both the Kindertransports and the Dinera Boys stories are represented at the museums. However, they are in separate parts. In the Sydney Jewish Museum, it says that Kinder went to England rather than Britain, which I know some people interchange the word, but it suggests that the British narrative, or rather the English-centred narrative, has been exported to other countries, and saying England rather than Britain excludes the narratives from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But what is interesting about the Sydney Museum is that in their definition of the Kindertransports, they include the US, Switzerland, Sweden, Holland and Palestine, and of course Britain. The narratives of the children are displayed towards the end of the exhibitions, which is really interesting. Similar objects are on display, but interestingly, the suitcase is not used within other areas of the exhibit at the Jewish Holocaust Museum in Melbourne. So Kindertransport objects that are on display at this museum are a sketchbook, and a birthday card which reads, "I hope the second part of your life is as interesting but less stormy than the first part." So this story is interesting because Laura first went to Belgium and then to Britain, and she was reunited with her mother in England. And then next steps for my work is that to start to make some comparisons between British, New Zealand, and that should say Australia as well, to think where this story of the Kindertransports are placed within the wider exhibition, and how this affects our understanding. So the case study starts to reveal how Kindertransports are represented and remembered in Britain, but also in other nations around the globe. So do the exhibitions reveal wider links? How do the definitions within the exhibitions affect our memory of the Kindertransports? From what I've seen so far in New Zealand and Australia, these two countries are much more open to discuss wider stories that link to the Kindertransports. In Britain, they're very, very narrow. And thank you, and any questions?
Okay, I'd like to give Amy a round of applause. We'll have a bit of a question session and an opportunity to talk to Amy if you have anything that you would like to offer. But I found it very interesting what you were saying about how the British tend to compartmentalise. So they'll talk about these sort of the experiences of the children, but they don't directly connect it back to what happened to the rest of the families, like families breaking up, or in good circumstances where there was reunion, but often not, and the continued story of difficulties after they had to start their lives again. So can I take any questions or comments from you?
I've just got one question, if I may. In any of the British museums exhibitions for Kindertransport, do they mention the Quakers' role as far as the Kindertransport?
Not that I know of. Maybe the temporary exhibition, the Vienna Library have, but I don't think none of the main exhibitions do. So the Imperial War Museums or Beth Shalom, they don't incorporate Quakers.
Are the Quakers acknowledged as having a part in the Kindertransport?
Definitely. Definitely in terms of secondary literature, but in terms of exhibitions, less so. They're more shown in temporary exhibitions. There isn't really a permanent exhibition to them.
Actually, sorry, I think in Laura's story they mention the Quakers downstairs.
They do, which is this.
Yeah, I'm interested about that thing with the Quakers.
Yeah.
So here they mention the Quakers.
Yeah, it's really interesting that in both in New Zealand and here, the story is broadened in a way. It incorporates all these other narratives, and you're much more open to talk about all these things that link to the Kindertransports, whereas in Britain they're just seen as arriving and they're here and that's it.
Any other questions?
I was going to say that the reason that's the story the reason those objects are on display is because that's the only stuff we have of a Kindertransport. It's not like we've, just to be clear.
Oh yeah,
for your research.
Yeah.
It's not that we've chosen from a broad range because Kindertransport's not a real big Australian story, whereas obviously in Britain it is a big story connected to the Holocaust. Until, 3 years ago maybe, can't remember when, we had nothing on display about Kindertransport because we might have mentioned it in some text, but there was nothing to display. That was the first set of objects that have come in.
There's also the Johannes or John Bright.
That's come in more recently, and it's just letters.
Exactly.
Putting letters on display, is not such a... Although the letters are very amazing, what they tell you, if you put letters on display, it's not a real good display item.
The laws one was really interesting, just from what we were talking about this morning though. I know it wasn't like a conscious decision to go through, and that was the story picked, but that one object has opened so many other narratives, which is really interesting, narratives that she came via via Belgium, which is really interesting. Like, that's not discussed in Britain.
I think we have another survivor here who went on a Kindertransport to Belgium, which is George Ginsberg, and then he ended up in Auschwitz for the entire war. So he was caught subsequently in France, I think, and But yeah, he did go on a Kindertransport from Berlin to Belgium.
Oh, is he part of the La Hoyle children, or?
I don't know what it is, but
Because that was a group that went to Belgium,
Oh, okay.
and then they fled through France.
okay.
Um,
He's not very sharp with his memory these days, so but he's here on a Friday,
oh wow.
which is tomorrow, no?
What
No,
day
it's
are we on?
Wednesday.
It's
Wednesday.
Wednesday.
So on Friday you could meet him.
Yeah.
But having said that, when we got this collection, we were very excited to put it on display. If we had others, we still might have put that one on display.
Yeah.
Because to actually have the tag is
Incredible.
yeah, very powerful.
Definitely.
I was just wondering if Edith Pegg gave you anything when she was alive. Let me ask the children. Because she went with her brother. She was actually quite old. Like, not
For a child.
For a
Yeah.
child.
We
Is
have,
this
we have
pictures
two
your
Kindertransport
My
here.
family.
Oh, right.
But so you have items. There's still
Ah,
people
right.
that
She
donate
might-
items.
Yeah,
to
I'll
the centre.
ask. So there might be photos or something.
Wow.
These two people here are Kindertransport.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Well, I think she was 17, so that was quite old, but her brother was younger. I'll ask. They might have something.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
And there is a doll somewhere out in the community that I'm working on.
Oh, incredible. There's especially those like with the doll or a suitcase or those items that are still used today. Like with the Button Memorial, you know, those items that are just everyday and are in our world constantly is really interesting in terms of memory. And the links they have with childhood, but like it's not as if like they've gone through a normal childhood. It's all this upheaval that they've gone through, and to still have the doll as a reference point is really, really interesting.
Also, are you, because it's called, you're talking about Kindertransport, which to me is a specific thing that happened, but there are
Yeah.
other child rescues. So you're looking at child
Yeah.
rescue, because the Dextons are child rescue, but it's not Kindertransport.
Yeah, so I see the Kindertransport in stages.
Yeah.
So the initial rescue of children to Britain from 38 to 39, with Winton involved
Yeah.
with that. Then you have Rabbi Schoenfeld and his Kindertransports, both prior to and after the war. But of course, the children that survived the camps had a totally different experience to children.
No, I mean, like, there was some child rescue schemes to Australia
Yeah,
that are not called Kindertransports.
Kindertransports. Yeah, yeah.
So we did an exhibition some years ago, and I can try and find the text for you that we.
Oh, great.
And we focused on some child rescue to Australia. So
Oh,
that
incredible.
was some years ago.
Because it would be interesting to find out how many
There's a
Danera
book.
boys were formerly Kinder.
How many what?
How many Danera boys?
So Danera
were
Boys is
formerly
not
Kinder.
child rescue. It's not Kindertransport at all.
But some on the Danera came over as Kinder,
Yes,
and
yes,
then they were
yes,
shipped off.
So it's like sponsoring, say, what was it, 3,000 children?
Yeah.
came? I think there was much
much
less
less
than that,
than that.
maybe 500.
And some went to America too.
Yes, they
There's
went
a
to
book.
America. Yeah.
Was that through the Jewish, the
There was
Australian
Jewish welfare.
Mm.
And there were two
Sponsored.
Yeah.
schemes that
Frank-
brought children out.
Okay, I think Frank wants to. Frank,
Frank,
did you want to talk about your?
Would you like to talk about your
experience?
experience?
Yeah. Okay. Did you want to stand up?
Amy, I agree with you that Kristallnacht and the Kindertransport are connected. I was 8, my sister was 10, so we remember Kristallnacht
Yeah.
very well. I remember it very, very well. I was 8, and my father used to have a shop selling hats and caps. On Kristallnacht he was taken to Dachau. And he was there for 5 months, and he told me that it was before the war. It was like a prison. People didn't get killed in Dachau. People, if they did what they were told, nothing happened to them. Food was adequate, and there was even a canteen, so that if you wanted to buy chocolates and biscuits, you were allowed to buy chocolates and biscuits and cigarettes. So it was like it was a military camp. But if, for example, you didn't do what you were told, then you were shot on the spot. For example, in the morning, all the inmates had to go outside. It was in November, So it was quite cold in the morning. So at 6:30 had to go outside and have the names called out. And you weren't allowed to smoke. And one Jewish guy, he had a cigarette behind his back, and he was shot dead on the spot. But if you did what you were told, then nothing happened to you. My father was in Dachau about 5 months, from November till about 5 months, and the only reason why he was able to leave Dachau was because at that time the Germans wanted to get rid of the Jews. They didn't want to kill them, they wanted to get rid of the Jews. And if you had a permit to go overseas, then you were let out. So my mother got a false passport and visas and for England, and that's how she managed to get get my father out of prison, out of Dachau. The actual Kindertransport, we left Vienna on the 11th of July, and we arrived in London on the 13th of July. There were, I don't know exactly how many children, but I would say there might have been about 80 children on the transport, and they had 3 people looking after them. One of them was a distant cousin of ours, so it was easy for my parents to let us go because a relative was actually on the same transport looking after the children. And interesting enough, my sister wrote a letter when we got to England to her parents, to our parents in Vienna, and I wrote a letter. And I've got these letters, and I've discovered my sister's letter quite recently, and she mentions in the letter that our cousin there, she was in charge of the babies, so they actually had babies on the transport, and had girls up to the age of about 16, 17, so it was quite a mixed crowd. Apparently, we were separated, the boys were separated from the girls, and it took we slept 2 nights on the Kindertransport. We slept the first night on a train going to Holland, and then the second night we slept on a boat going it was in Harwich. We landed in Harwich. So from Holland we went to Harwich and then to London. In London, when we arrived, we had an uncle who had previously gone there, and he brought his grandparents to London, and we joined the grandparents and the uncle in London.
And there's that picture of you, Frank, arriving with your sister. They were
The
photographed when they arrived.
The interesting, when we arrived in London, a press photographer took this photograph. Unfortunately, there's no. My uncle saw it in the newspaper, so he cut it out, but he didn't cut out there must have been some wording there as well. But that was taken on the 13th of July. That's the day we arrived in London. On 13th of July 1939. If you've got the time, if you want to do, I'm sure if you gave them the date, they will probably find out the article that went with it.
They're carrying their fur coats.
I don't know.
Frank, how long did you stay in England?
I was 8 when I arrived.
Yes.
And I left when I was 18, so 10 years. I had all my schooling in England.
Okay. And did you work at all? Or?
I knew I was in, when you were 18 in England, you had to join the army for 2 years.
Okay.
My parents didn't want me to join the army, so I knew I was leaving soon after my birthday. My birthday was 27th of January, and we planned to leave very soon after. In fact, we left on the 8th of February to come here. So I was working just to kill, just pass it. And actually, my father wanted to go into knitwear. So I took a job in a factory in knitwear in London.
Okay. So both of your parents, you were reunited with both of your parents in England?
They came. My parents came 4 weeks after we came. So they arrived in England 2 weeks before the war started.
Right. And what about extended family from Germany?
From extended family. Well, I had another aunt and uncle in England. They
Right.
went to America before the war.
Oh, okay.
And
So you had an English connection from before the war?
no, I didn't. I was born in Vienna.
Yeah. No. But your parents had an English connection from
No,
before.
what happened? My uncle had a schmutter business,
Right.
and he used to export to England.
Mm-hmm.
And when he saw the writing on the wall,
Yeah.
he told the manager in England
Yeah.
to stop sending him the money, and he's coming over.
Okay.
So he escaped over the border.
Right.
And he went to England, so he actually had money,
Okay.
and he was able to buy an apartment,
Mhm.
or rent an apartment,
Yes.
and that's why he was able to bring his parents over,
Mm-hmm.
and also us.
Okay.
But we only stayed with them about a month because my parents came a month later.
Sure. Okay. So in the late 40s, your family decided to emigrate to Australia. Is that
Oh,
right?
no, yeah, and then
And
yeah, no,
why was
yeah. My father and I left in by February 1949.
yes.
Just the two of us, and then my father wanted to find out whether he could make a living here.
Right.
And 2.5 years later, my mother and my sister followed.
Mm. Did you keep in contact with any other people who were on the same Kindertransport as you?
No, they had no contact whatsoever.
Did you meet any other
No.
people from Kindertransport
No.
while you were in
No,
England?
no.
Okay. And have you had any contact with people since you've been in Australia as a shared experience?
No, first of all, I'm surprised that we're the only ones that are here from the Kindertransport. But I don't know of anybody here.
Right. So there's no sort of groups that meet up.
I haven't actually I haven't sort of gone out of my way to find out.
Right. And obviously you've seen the display downstairs. You've seen the display in our museum. Have you seen? You've been to our museum. Yeah. So, do you have any comments about how Kindertransport is represented? Just that you could give some feedback to Amy.
No, I mean the fact that we were well looked after during the transport.
Sure.
Interestingly enough, like first of all, when we came to England, the wars after my parents came, end of July, no, middle of July, and then the war started.
Yes.
And at that time, all the schools in London were evacuated to the country,
Right.
and we were in the small country town called Royston, which is in Hertfordshire. You would know it, near Cambridge.
Mm-hmm.
So we were there with non-Jewish people for the whole war, the 5 years of the war.
Right.
And
What, separated from your parents, or with your parents, or
No. My
not with
parents
your
were in London the whole
Okay.
war. And interesting enough, in spite of the fact, first of all, my sister and I were in different billets when we were evacuated. Interestingly enough, that we did not. Obviously, we couldn't speak the language.
Okay.
We lived with English people. They couldn't speak the German. We couldn't speak English. Apparently, my parents came to see us 3 months. We were there in September, and they came 3 months for Christmas to give the people we stayed with presents. And my parents said we were speaking fluent English in those 3 months.
Amazing.
But we were in different homes in the same township. But interestingly enough, I don't think we ever suffered sort of any mental, all the trauma we went through. We did not suffer mentally. Not my sister, not I. Well, maybe other kids did.
When you were separated from each other and from your parents, were you able to keep in contact through post or phone?
Oh yeah, no, not by phone, but every holidays we used to go from Royston to London if there wasn't too much bombing.
Right.
And we used to stay the whole holidays in London. And I said, we weren't traumatized by what we'd been through. In spite of the fact my father was in Dachau and we witnessed Kristallnacht. My father's shop was closed and the goods were stolen. Exactly as like the stories go. And of course, on the day of when we went to Dachau, the father was one of thousands of men it was only men that were taken to Dachau.
Did you hear of news when you were in England? Did you hear, I mean, as the war was going on, did you hear of news of the Holocaust as it was happening, or things happening to Jews?
No,
Nothing at all?
No.
And at the end of the war, did you have a sense of what was your response to when you did hear about the terrible things that had happened?
About the
Holocaust, about all the genocide.
Well, everybody was horrified.
Yeah. So did you feel that you had escaped that inevitable?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, my father lost all his family. I mean, he was one of 7,
Right.
and he lost all of them except one brother who was also in Vienna.
Okay.
And I don't know what happened to him, but his wife was in France after the war.
Okay.
But
And on your
my
mother's
mother the
side?
same. My mother, she most of her, nobody stayed back in Europe. Went to America, went to England, but my mother actually didn't lose anybody because of the war. But my father lost everybody. He tried to get them through the Red Cross. He tried to get, but there was just no record at all of them. So the whole family, a big family with.
Frank, thank you so much. We'll wind up this session. Does anyone else have any comments or contributions? Or Amy will be here for another couple of hours, so or all day if you need to speak to it. And just a final round of applause and thank you, Frank.
Thank you so much.